As a advocate and scholar of diversity and inclusion, people let's say disagree with you often. How do you convince them, or how do you engage in dialogue with them without alienating them?
Yes. So certainly the areas that I study are controversial, or they can seem controversial on the face. But I think, first of all, particularly when I present some of this similar material in my courses, it's really hard to argue with evidence. So I use a lot of scientific research to help describe not only the magnitude of the issue and the problems, because I study overt and subtle discrimination in the workplace, but also the capacity for organizations to improve employees' feelings of belonging and psychological safety, and improve the diversity supportive climate within the organization. There's so much that people can do to improve people's working experiences. So usually I use data to establish the phenomenon, provide evidence of dismally low unemployment rates, provide evidence of experiences of discrimination, particularly experimental studies in which, only one identity was manipulated. So it rules out all these other alternative explanations. And then once I think people see the incontrovertible evidence, then I really love to start talking about interventions and strategies that organizations can use to be effective and improve the experiences of potentially marginalized employees in their workplaces. Because I think that's what a lot of people hear when we start talking about these issues is, oh, like organizations are so bad and they've done all these terrible things in the past. And if I've benefited or if I haven't experienced any of those things, then the judgment, that's sort of the implicit judgment about me as well. And so I think it's great to try and establish with really strong evidence that there's undeniably still an issue, even if you haven't experienced it. And then focusing on solutions, because usually people really want to do the right thing. They can just kind of get entrenched in their own viewpoint. So that's typically how I usually start the conversation, particularly with people who may be skeptical. But I do think that there's a difference between healthy skepticism and critical thinking versus blind defensiveness. And I certainly try to pick the moments and the people with to engage that I think will affect, we'll have a productive conversation, because there are probably a handful of people with which it's not going to be a productive engagement. So I think the earlier you can kind of identify that, the better.
So first is you have to choose your battles, and you have to stick to your facts, right? So that's the crux of it.
Yeah. I have colleagues who suggest that sometimes even fact-based arguments are difficult with like highly educated, highly knowledgeable people, but I personally haven't run into that. But I really do stick to what I know better than anybody else. I think the wheels can come off the bus if you're portraying other people's research that you might not know as well. So if I portray other people's research, I am certain that I know it 100%, or my research, because it's hard. Because then I can answer every question. Usually what happens is there's a question or boundary condition that somebody thinks is playing more of a role than like you've represented. And usually I can answer all of those questions if I'm talking about a body of research, or I can say, well, that's a great point, but this is what this, and this say about that point, which can be really helpful.
I see. So you're working in organizational psychology. You could have chosen so many subfields within that. What inspired you to choose diversity, equity, and inclusion, this particular research agenda?
That's a great question. I think, so I went into the applied world after I was an undergraduate. I graduated. I got a job with a global organization that everyone would recognize. And I just found out that I was working so much and I wasn't necessarily super passionate about what I was doing in the same way that I was in college. In college, I was involved in a lot of volunteering. In class, that's the beauty of class, is you can tailor a lot of projects around your interests. And I just thought, well, if I'm going to be spending this much of my time doing something, I would really like to do something that matters. So then I got involved in research, and I just thought it was so cool and so powerful to answer these questions about a population I really cared about, in a way that sort of no other experience I had was able to, like finding evidence, finding the gaps in the evidence, and then figuring out ways to fill in those gaps. And I have a master's degree in special education research, specifically post-secondary employment. And I was really fascinated in what happens when people who have disabilities leave the secondary school system. How do they get into post-secondary, not only education, but employment specifically? And there was just like a huge gap in not only service and social supports, but also research around this. So I was really interested in this in my master's program. I did applied work and research on this topic. And then when I went into, I was applying to PhD programs, I had sort of two paths. I could stay like the special education route. I had worked with a lot of individuals in that vein. And it was really meaningful work. I felt like I definitely made a difference, but what was marked to me was that it was very much one individual at a time. So I was making incremental, I think highly meaningful incremental change, but I was frustrated at the pace of that change. And to me, it just seemed like the obvious place to go was we need employers to be involved in this. And this can make a much larger magnitude of change at a faster pace. So as soon as I learned more about organizational psychology, and then I learned that people studied diversity related issues within that sort of boundary condition, I thought that would just be the perfect fit for me. And frankly, although my first passion is the disability social identity, I'm passionate about all marginalized and minoritized identities, because my pedagogy or my framework is quite simply that if you have this feeling that there's one social identity that it's so unfair that they're marginalized and left out and have this experience, you can't feel that way about one social identity unless you feel that way about all marginalized social identities, because we have to be consistent in the way that we approach people from minoritized backgrounds in the workplace. And as soon as I kind of got to that conclusion, it was really, I think it was easy. It was not, let me put it this way. No PhD program is easy by any means, but it was easy for me to understand why I was there in a way that I think a lot of people struggled with more than me, because I had sort of done the trotting around before I wound up in my PhD program, and I really knew what I wanted to research. I really knew why I was there. I really knew that there was a huge population of people beyond just people with disabilities who really needed the research that we were doing. And that really helped me, that helped me power through any struggles that you experience in a PhD program.
Yeah, I agree. Means unless until you're motivated or you have some strong motives to complete your PhD, it is very difficult to walk that path. Yes. So that brings us to last question of this interview, and it has two components. So let's say, suppose somebody is interested in academic career. What would you suggest to that person? Second is more generic. Suppose somebody is trying to be an advocate for DEI. What would be your suggestion for these two group of people?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I would say I always suggest those who want to make the transition either into postgraduate academia or coming back oftentimes into academia, research experience is essential. So if it's sort of an undergraduate student who's contemplating graduate school, I really encourage them to join a research lab. I always, offer, I'm saying a research lab could be my research lab, doesn't have to be my research lab. Just get exposure with research, because that's really the day-to-day of what we do. And the more experience you have with that prior to applying to, for example, a PhD program, the more prepared you're going to be, the less onerous that transition is going to be. If it's somebody else who's sort of coming back to academia, I still make the same recommendation, which is just get involved with research in a research lab. There's really no substitute for that experience. And I don't think there's anything wrong with being involved in multiple research labs, because then you get experience with different types of methods, different types of philosophies. And really it's exposure with the PI, but it's also the experience that you get with the other graduate students, the other students in the lab. Because oftentimes if you're new, there's a lot of other people who have a lot more experience and know more around you, and you can learn a lot from just working in a team of people who have been doing it longer. So I think those are really important pieces that prospective students don't often factor in. I think everybody really is focused on if your graduate program takes the GREs or maybe the GMATs or whatever the standardized test is, like people know that and are focused on that. And then I don't know that there's much you can do about your GPA in your senior year of college, or like, especially if you're coming back to academia, but they certainly, I think, understand that that is important. And then really the only other component is that personal statement. So I think the personal statement is important, but ideally it should build off of your research experiences in the lab. So ideally you're incorporating a lot of research in that personal statement to highlight your aptitudes and your abilities. And then the other component, of course, are letters of recommendation. And that's another reason I get involved in a research lab, because you'll have a tighter working relationship with the PI or PIs in that lab. And those are the people that you need to write you strong letters of recommendation. I think the key is that they really need to be strong, because typically most letters are generally favorable. So you have to really stand out from the crowd. And the only way that that really is differentiated is if you have a strong working relationship. Time is a factor. Like, I always ask us, how long have you known this person? So if you have a longer relationship, it's usually easier for the PI to say more about you, have more context, have like more perspective. But really a strong letter can also emerge from a short relationship if you've really distinguished yourself in a short amount of time. So those would be my piece of advice for folks who are interested in pursuing graduate school or sort of upper level academia. In terms, I think, was the second question around what advice I would give to people who want to pursue diversity, equity, inclusion. Trying to advocate for DEI. Um, yes. Okay. So I'm going to assume that this is more of like a workplace perspective. So I'm an employee in a workplace that is trying to advocate for DE&I related principles. I think it's really important. It's really important to have a pulse on the organization's priorities. So is it the case, like, I would take stock of my social surroundings. So is it the case that this organization has not been supportive of minoritized identities up until this point, and they're trying to make a change? Is it the case that they have always been pretty supportive, but they're trying to really ramp up their practices to be even more supportive? Or is it the case that they have historically really had a bad track record? Because what the bucket that the organization falls into would tell me a lot of information about how to pursue diversity, equity, inclusion oriented initiatives within the context of that organization. If it's a pretty positive place, they're looking to just sort of double down and really like even get to the next level. That's a much easier place to be, especially if you're thinking like, oh, well, they really care about this, but they've missed a few identities, or they don't have nearly the support that I would want in terms of mentorship or more formal programming on a regular basis. Certainly, leadership buy-in is key for diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives to be effective. Because one thing we know is there's all sorts of different tools and initiatives that you can implement, but they work so much better if they're working in concert. So in the class that I teach, we start at the individual level and we end at the organizational level. And we end sort of in the vein of diversity, equity, inclusion as a strategy. And I always talk to them about how the organization has a corporate strategy, and diversity should not be separate from that corporate strategy. To be as effective as possible, those two strategies should ideally be rolled in together, and they should certainly be complementary. So if the strategy for the organization is to like be more innovative, then the diversity strategy should support ways to get divergent thinkers working together across the organization or in the organization. So those things should be holding hands and working in concert. So I think that's a really important point that a lot of people miss. Like the one-off programming, I think grassroots support is really important because it can influence leadership buy-in. But truly, like leadership buy-in is a critical linchpin for these practices being effective at really shaping the culture of the organization. If it's an organization that's like trying to do a little change management, like we haven't been so great, but we really are committed to change. We want to be great in the future. Again, I'd figure out, we call them diversity champions. In the disability research, I call them disability champions, but it's essentially the person at the organization that's in the leadership position that's championing the change or the program, because they're the ones that have the power to make decisions. And you need their buy-in and their support to listen to you if you have ideas, or if you want to contribute, factor you in to help supporting those programs. And so that really, I would say, is even more important component if the organization is sort of trying to go through change management. And if you're in an organization that's just incredibly resistant and maybe has some toxicity, that's a really tough circumstance to be in. I would say there's a lot to be said for microcosms within big organizations that are maybe supportive of one another. Employee resource groups, I know a lot of organizations use them, but sometimes they kind of are a safe haven for people of similar identities if there's a larger toxic culture. So I would think more about, if your organization isn't really going to change and you're feeling like there's some toxicity there, to find individuals closer at your level, well, irrespective of level, that you can get together with, that have similar or social identities or have the same values that you do, and have a small support culture within them. And I know there's many more types of circumstances than those, but I just think that the context matters so much, and how we pursue diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives within organizations, and just also acknowledging that no initiative, DE&I initiative, is a silver bullet. They really work in tandem, and that's like the key to affecting change. But also I feel like incremental change is really valuable and important. So I never shy away from doing something that I believe in, even if it's at the individual level, even if it's me affecting change that affects one other person. I still think that's really highly valuable. And that's oftentimes the way you can get momentum on some of these initiatives.
Right. I think these are great suggestions for whoever wants to be in academia, or whoever wants to be an advocate for DEI. Thank you so much, Professor, for this conversation. I know this turned out to be a little bit lengthier than I expected, but it was amazing conversation. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, and absolutely no problem. It was great to be here.